Welcome to Real Rover. I'm your roving host, John Craig. Real Rover へようこそ、クレイグ・ジョンでございます。Introducing you to people you would never have heard of if it wasn't for Real Rover. Here we go. On Real Rover is Dr. Eric Wargo, and he is the author of this book, Time Loops, and we're going to be going into the subject of this book today, amongst other things. The subtitle of the book, as you can see, is Precognition, Causation, and the Unconscious. Of course, I've read the book in preparation for the interview, and to give our readers a bit of a taste of what's in this book, I'm going to start, Eric, with a bit of a koan for you. But I know you know the answer already. What do tesseracts, Phil Dick, photosynthesis, the Titanic, Freudian dreams, Norman Mailer, UFO, quantum entanglement, sexy science tests, the block universe, synchronicity, remote viewing, the occult, anthropology, archetypes, and Jacques Vallée all connect to?
The answer is retrocausation.
Cool. That's retrocausation. So let's start by defining terms. Where does retrocausation lead us intellectually? What does it point to?
Well, what it points to that's most interesting and applicable to our lives, you and me, is precognition, which is a large category that means any kind of seeing the future, feeling the future, responding to the future unconsciously, or just being influenced by events ahead of us in time. Now, retrocausation is the kind of more technical physics term to describe this. And this is a real thing. I mean, this is one of the growing interpretations of quantum mechanics, quantum physics, is the idea that causal influences travel both directions in time. That it's not just, causality isn't just like particles hitting each other like billiard balls and going in one direction, but that those billiard balls are sending information backwards into their histories.
Oh, Einstein's not going to like this.
Einstein will love it. Einstein will love it. Einstein will love it. Because what it leads to is it actually rescues Einstein's relativity from the kind of onslaught of traditional interpretations of quantum physics that have prevailed for, nearly a century now. The famous Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. It says that, there's no reality until someone observes it. Now that's a cool sounding idea. All right. And it's been very inspiring for philosophers and stuff. But it's starting to look like the reality is different from that.
Oh,
yeah.
You have my attention, because a lot of people have been harping on about the observer effect in consciousness for a long time. So what's your rebuttal of it?
Well, my rebuttal is that another way of interpreting all the kind of spooky quantum stuff that we all know and love, another way of interpreting all this is simply this idea of retrocausation, that influences pass backward in time as well as forward. And so, it'll seem like you do an experiment and it'll seem like, well, somehow my measurement of the experiment determined the collapse of the wave function. That's a famous phrase in quantum physics. Well, another way of looking at it is simply that there was no wave function, that the particle, that your measurement is part of the causal story of that particle, and you had to be there measuring it because you're part of the future of that particle. There's no wave function out there that collapses when someone observes it. Every interaction is sending influences backward in time as well as forward in time. So this is a very radical and exciting new way of looking at physics.
This is a really radical way of looking at physics, and you're going to have a lot of fun and some major battles down the road here, I know, which is why I'm interested, because we don't have enough iconoclasts around these days. Everybody's on the same bandwagon, you know. String theory, wow, string theory, cool. But now finally, we've got people coming out and saying, hey, string theory has not come up with one successful prediction in its whole life, and billions of dollars has been spent on this. So I think we're in a time where we need a lot more challenges to this holy grail world of quantum physics or Einstein's dimension. And what you've come forward with, which really excited me, was a different way of looking at it. For example, synchronicity. It's on the edge of their lips. Synchronicity. And well, what's synchronicity? An acausal, what? Oh, well, there's a story you gave. Maybe you can share it of Jung and his patient and the scarab, and your way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, that's a classic story, and you know, it's a wonderful example of how you can reinterpret these anomalous phenomena in a retrocausal way, and it's even more powerful, this kind of explanation. So here's the story, and this is, everyone, at least in the West, knows this story. I don't know how it's been translated in Japan, but Carl Jung's in his office one day, and he's treating a patient. She's a young woman who is very hyper-rationalistic. She can't break out of this very hyper-rational mindset. And anyway, but she's telling him this dream that she had. She had the night before, she had this dream that someone gave her a golden piece of jewelry in the shape of a scarab, an Egyptian scarab beetle. Well, just as she's telling him this dream, he hears a knocking on the window behind him, and he turns around, and at the window, there's this it's called a rose chafer beetle. It's the sort of European equivalent of the scarab beetle. And so he opens the window and cups it in his hand and hands it to this woman and said, here's your scarab. Okay, well now in Jung's writing on this, this is somehow the cosmos archetypes, aligning to bring together this woman who's telling him her dream about a scarab and the scarab at the window. Like, okay, wow, magically, acausally, this all comes together and it all has this effect on the woman of breaking her out of her rationalistic shell and all that. Well, a much simpler way of looking at it is that this woman simply had a precognitive dream the night before. She dreamed of that event. Someone hands her a scarab. Well, that's exactly what happened in Jung's office. And so it's actually really a very simple, there are a million cases of this in literature and in scientific studies and so forth. This is a common thing. I'm sure many of your listeners and viewers have had this exact same experience. I know you have. I've had hundreds of these experiences. And the thing that keeps people from seeing that simple explanation is that, well, she had to tell him, she was telling him the dream, and that's what got him to notice the beetle and let it into her office. But and they somehow think that, well, maybe that's paradoxical somehow. It's not a paradox. It's actually a time loop. It's a causal loop. Him handing her the scarab caused her to have the dream the night before, and that dream caused her to tell him about the dream and caused him to notice the scarab, which caused him to let it into the window, which caused the dream the night before. So it's a loop, and it's very hard for us to wrap our heads around that.
Indeed it is, Eric, and this is where the challenge will come to most people. By the way, your expression there of saying it's simpler, an explanation, goes right along with Occam's razor, which is a fundamental tenet of science. If you have a bunch of different explanations, of course, the simplest one tends to be the one that's closest to the truth. And so for the whole universe to somehow operate mysteriously through synchronicity to bring these two meaningful causal things together is a lot more difficult an operation than what you're describing. But we have the mental block here. Wait a minute, time just goes this way. There's no way you can have causation coming from the future. So maybe this is a good time to introduce people to Minkowski's block universe to kind of give them an idea of how that could be.
Right. Well, this kind of thing, what I'm describing, retrocausation, really, you can only be influenced by an event in the future if that event happens in the future, right? So we sometimes, when people think about precognition, they think, well, maybe somehow you're seeing a possible future, but not, and it's up to you to and you can maybe change that future. But then if you change it, there's no future. If you prevent that outcome from occurring, there's no future event that can then influence you. So that's a paradox. That's actually a paradoxical idea. This concept that the future is like a wave function of open possibilities, and that we determine through our choices what the actuality is. That actually doesn't work as well as an explanation for retrocausation and precognition as a block universe. Now, the block universe, this was Einstein's teacher, Hermann Minkowski. Based on Einstein's special theory of relativity, he goes, wow, this is really important here. This means the implication of Einstein's relativity theory is that the universe, that fourth dimension of time, is every bit as fixed as the three dimensions of space. And so that you can visualize the universe as a gigantic block in 4 dimensions. Now we have trouble visualizing, we can't visualize in 4 dimensions, but if you can just imagine a 3-dimensional, cube, for instance, a three-dimensional block, and just pretend that there's just 2 space dimensions, and one of those dimensions is time. And that everything's fixed in there. And so, for instance, a particle, say, is really a line going through that block. And a person, likewise, is a world line going through that block. And so what we experience at any given moment is a cross-section of that block. And that concept makes sense of retrocausation. As long as the future, in some sense, already exists in that block, then it's possible to be influenced by it. Now, retrocausation in physics laboratories, this is occurring over teeny tiny spans of time. But what I argue, and what other people have argued, is that biological systems can scale this up and can expand that length of time over which those retrocausal influences can be detected. And that the argument is that the brain is really this 4-dimensional information processor that's giving us information about our entire life ahead of us as well as behind us in the form of memory. In fact, I argue that precognition is just 1/2 of memory. It's all memory, and precognition is just the part of our memory that's ahead of us in time. And we have trouble identifying those things that are ahead of us in time because they're not attached to biographical events that we know about yet. And so we we kind of get confused by them, and we may ignore them or may interpret them in different ways than precognition. But that, basically all of our life experiences are already in some sense here, right now.
That's, the block universe, the idea of the cross section, I think a lot of people can get. It was Einstein that came up, I think, with the idea or the term, the space-time continuum. And from a very, very simple perspective, if all of space, if all of the universe already exists, which appears to be the case, it's not like, well, they say it's expanding, those bits of it don't exist yet. Okay, there's that argument. But if all of space already exists, and it's a continuum with time, then all of time, by definition, should already exist, which will, of course, include our future. And we have a lot of time travel movies, a lot of concepts that are coming out now that are starting to tickle people's imagination. But you're saying in this book that precognition, which we all experience, some people will call it synchronicity, but precognition is actually not a more developed, evolved part of our brain consciousness. It's actually rudimentary, and that it may have a lot to do with our survival. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things that follows from this idea of a block universe and retrocausation in a block universe is that, there, like I said, there has to be that event that you precognize has to be there in the block universe for you to precognize it. Okay. Well, that has an interesting implication that you have to survive long enough for that event to reach you in the past. Okay?
Yes.
You have to still be alive at that later time point that you have precognized, right? So imagine how that might work as a survival mechanism, right? Imagine you have a primitive single-celled creature, okay, in the Earth's primordial soup, 2 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago. An organism that somehow can do what I call time binding. Actually, it's not my term. That's a term from a philosopher, Korzybski, in the last century. But if you have an organism that can reach ahead into its future, and I'm talking even, milliseconds into its future, and somehow pull itself toward that survival situation, milliseconds into its future, it's going to have a selective advantage over an organism that doesn't have that ability, right? So that's why I argue that precognition is really based on something very, very primitive. This could be, and this is not the main point of my book, but this could be the very basis of life itself. This could be kind of this ability to reach into the future, even a very tiny little distance, and kind of pull towards that survival.
So it's more like basic sensory perception rather than ESP. It's built in.
Right.
And
Great.
What was interesting about your a load of scientific experiments that you write about that were done, suggesting that precognition is very, very real. What interested me was that the test results were off the scale, not just for so-called ESP tests, but for normal tests. And so you're suggesting that it is so natural a part of us that it will actually show up in the science. So can you tell us just briefly, of all the experiments that you quote in your book, which one is the most easily understandable for newcomers to this world of testing psychic abilities?
Yeah, well, there have been a lot of really cool experiments, as you can imagine, in parapsychology. Parapsychology it's a term that's been around since I think 1932. But the very best parapsychology experiment in my book are the experiments that were conducted by a man named Daryl Bem. He's a very eminent psychologist. He's not a parapsychologist. I mean, he had a long, distinguished career in mainstream scientific psychology, studying things like personality development and so forth. And but in around 2000, he started doing a series of experiments where he reversed the causal order in a number of very standard paradigms in psychology. For instance, your viewers might or may not be familiar with the concept of priming. Okay, this is something that's done in psychology to test unconscious biases and unconscious thought processes. So, for instance, a subject will be asked to make a choice on a computer screen, like clicking, which item they prefer or something like that. But before they make their choice, they might be given a subliminal message on the computer screen that sort of makes one of the choices more or less favorable. And they may be subliminal. They might not be realized they're getting that prime, but it nevertheless influences them. And so that's a typical priming task in psychology. Well, Daryl Bem decided, let's reverse the causal order here. He had people make a choice on their screen, and then they were flashed like a prime. So, for instance, they would have to pick one of two pictures, and then one of them would have the word ugly flashed over it, and so it would make them more likely to pick the other picture, or something like that. Well, he found that, my God, this subsequent exposure to this prime influenced their prior choice on the task. Now, the most famous one of his experiments is really funny. I mean, he had participants choose one of two. There would be two curtains on a computer screen, okay? And they were supposed to choose the one that had a picture behind it. But of course, they don't know which one has a picture behind it, so they're guessing, basically. But they would be correct more often than chance would predict when the picture that was revealed by their choice was an erotic photo, okay? Yeah. And when the picture was a neutral picture of just a sunset or something like that, it wasn't, it didn't influence their choice. Now, actually, he's not the only one to do experiments like this. Dean Radin is a very pioneering parapsychologist. He was the first to do these kinds of experiments, sort of using, for instance, arousing pictures versus neutral pictures and so forth. And he found autonomic responses that actually preceded the revelation of the photograph. But Daryl Bem's experiments were just really witty and kind of brilliant in that they just reversed the causal order of these standard psychology type of experiments. And what he found was incredibly significant. I mean, these were big experiments. I think there were 100 students in each one, and he did a series of 9 experiments and then published them all in 2011. And the article was called "Feeling the Future." And basically, it was really significant support for the idea that we are influenced unconsciously by things we will learn or see or encounter, ahead of us in time. And it's just really stunning finding. And it has since been replicated many, 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 many times. So, this type of experiment really produces very strong evidence.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence is out there, Eric. There, at a recent lecture in Tokyo, the speaker told the participants about an experiment whereby there would be 2 grips in front of the subject, and he would either squeeze the right one or the left one, and his brain was being scanned as this was going on, so that the quote-unquote decision centers in the brain would light up, presumably simultaneously with the moment when he decided whether he was going to grip right or left. So you can imagine he's sitting there, okay, which one am I going to do, left or right? So there's obviously a thought process that goes, I'm going to grab left or I'm going to grab right. But the result, which was replicated worldwide, was that the brain had lit up before the guy was aware of making the decision left or right. So that for me was stunning. It was 6 seconds before the brain registered. So, I mean, does that have something to do with these results, I'm wondering? Have you heard about that test?
I haven't heard about that specific one, but yeah, there's a lot of really interesting research like that. There was a researcher in the 1970s and 80s named Benjamin Libet. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. And he sort of classically found these really strange inconsistencies in the timing of our subjective experiences. First of all, he discovered that that different sensory signals travel at different speeds through the body and get processed at different rates, and yet the brain somehow synchronizes them up. And so he discovered that our experience of now, our experience of the present moment, is actually a construct. It's not, we're not actually experiencing the present moment. And this, when we start talking about Zen, this is a really interesting, this is obviously a really relevant and interesting fact. But even more, I guess, troublingly for a lot of people, he discovered that our experience of conscious will, in our choice to move our finger, that was his classic experiment, was that somehow before, it was like a fifth of a second before we decide to move a finger, the nerves in that finger already start to prime themselves to move. And this led to a lot of work by other psychologists, sort of designing experiments that some interpret as showing that, well, we don't really have any conscious will, that what we experience as consciousness is just after the fact, that something is deciding long before.
Yeah, this is very disturbing because, he did a fifth of a second, but now we're up to 6 seconds. So that somebody, somewhere, somehow, beyond your will, because this pulling of the trigger here is, I decided this second. We can time that. But actually 6 seconds before it all happened, it had all started and it had been tracked. So what does that say about free will and, the very big quagmire here?
Well, maybe, but there are different ways to look at it. And this is something I talk about a little bit in my book. There's another way of looking at it that, what we experience as the now of our conscious will might not be, like I said, the now is a construct. We now know there is no now. This is an invention of the brain anyway. And, what if in fact we're, as I say, put in the book, we're pulling our meat puppet strings from some other position on our timeline? What if we were actually, initiating our actions, from the future or from the past relative to that action when we already know it's going to be successful? I think this applies actually a lot, to experiences that, you mentioned archery, martial arts. When you're doing something very skilled, something you've practiced again and again, particularly, I'm a martial artist too, and they have that experience of being in this flow state, and you're not conscious of making these choices, and yet your body is very skillfully executing some action, parrying a blow, disabling your opponent, whatever. You're not conscious. You're in this flow. It's a very Zen kind of thing. This is what a lot of Westerners associate with Zen exclusively, is this kind of martial arts aspect of it. But it's, there's this idea that maybe our consciousness is expanded in time, and that in fact, this idea that we're not conscious at all. Maybe that's exactly opposite the truth. Maybe we are initiating our actions from the future, from the past. You got to start getting rid of this idea of the now as this narrow little cursor, like on a video editing timeline that's just moving, down the timeline. I mean, our subjectivity, our consciousness, whatever you want to call it, might be a broader swath of that timeline. And that's
Absolutely.
what
I think that's the exciting proposition. You suggest in the book that the unconscious is not as mysterious maybe as we think. You described it as our everyday consciousness displaced in time. And in fact, so that people don't mistake precognition for some absolutely vivid, clear, prophetic vision of what's going to happen from now. It's a lot messier than that. It's often not quite so clear because the unconscious works in symbolic language, just like her accessory became a physical beetle, which was knocking on the window of, that was an important part of the story, knocking on the window of Jung's studio when he heard it. So an accessory becomes a physical beetle, but the meaning is that of the scarab, right? So you spent a lot of time in the book going into Freud and Jung, and actually you give Jung a bit of a hammering, which is, in my case, about time, because we put all of these people up on pedestals for way too long, and the information is now coming at us so quickly, we can't afford to keep people on pedestals. So could you briefly go over how your idea counters the idea of archetypes and the collective unconscious, for example?
Yeah. Well, Jung made his argument. I gave Jung a hammering, but to be fair, Jung was doing the best with what he had. I mean, at the time he was writing, there really wasn't a concept of retrocausation.
Nope.
And he was even working with a physicist. Wolfgang Pauli, of course, was one of his friends, and it was in correspondence with Pauli that he developed the concept of synchronicity. But that the notion of retrocausation really, it had not taken hold in the 30s and 40s when he was developing this idea. And it's still hard for us. I mean, it's very hard to wrap our heads around that. So it was much easier for him to imagine, well, let's just collapse the time dimension. I think somewhere in his book, he even says that, essentially, collapse the time dimension and say that it's all essentially synchronous, okay? Well, when you do that, that's a little different. That's a different statement from talking about a blocked universe, where the future already exists and the future and the past interact in some way. He's saying, let's ignore these temporal, sequences of things, and let's just talk about meanings. Well, when you do that, I mean, okay, you can collapse those temporal sequences, and then you get this idea that, well, okay, maybe so it's meanings that are connecting all this. But then you're losing an important dimension. It's that sequence, I'm arguing, that temporal sequence. Okay, A, woman has a dream, dreams about scarab. Okay, B, she's in the office, tells him about the scarab. C, he hears knocking on the door, it's a scarab, blah, blah, blah. That sequence is really important to understanding this. Now, there's a further point in that story, which is only implicit in Jung's narrative, and that's that he proceeded to tell the patient about the meaning of scarab beetles. Okay, scarabs were already interesting to him. I mean, scarabs were really popular at that time in history anyway. People don't realize that, but Egyptian stuff was hugely popular. Freud had a bunch of scarabs in his office, and in fact, Jung saw those scarabs when he was in Jung's office. I'm sorry, Jung saw those scarabs when he was in Freud's office. Several years earlier. He had written about scarabs in his classic sort of text. I forget the title of it, Symbols of Transformation or whatever. So scarabs were already on his mind. So when this woman dreams of a scarab, he's ready with this big explanation for how scarabs are an ancient symbol of rebirth and blah, 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 blah. And that moment, that was a big important thing for this patient. You know, it's like patients love it when their doctor thinks their symptom or their dream is really interesting and then gives them a really fascinating explanation for what it means and relating it to ancient religion and all that. That's what people loved about Jung and what they still love about Jung. So this was an important moment in this patient's treatment and her life. And so it's natural that she would have a precognitive dream about this. Okay, but when you collapse that time dimension and then think, well, these are just archetypes. These are just eternal archetypes that are sort of pulling the strings of our lives. You lose that important dimension. So what I argue in the book, basically, and I'm not the first to argue with this, but I'm adding the precognitive dimension to it. That archetypes are not these platonic things hovering over us in the universe and pulling the strings. Archetypes are just meanings that are encoded in our culture. I mean, they're the books on Jung's bookshelf. You know, he had books on scarabs and all these Egyptian symbols. They were interesting to him. And when patients, you know, produce this stuff in their dreams, you know, either because they sensed unconsciously that he was interested in it, or precognitively, they precognized, they produced these dreams precognitively in his office. You know, it was easy for him to interpret it as, oh my God, it's confirmation that these are objective organizing structures in the universe, when in fact, they were just the books on his bookshelf, you know?
Yeah, very, very culturally programmed in a sense, you know. In Europe at that time, like you said, there was an Egyptian boom. It was cool. It was in people's minds, but if that patient had been Japanese, for example, you know, how might it have worked out? And, you know, in fact, in Japan, there's an expression, masa yume, which means exactly a prophetic dream, a dream that you have that actually happens. And it's, you know, it's been around for hundreds of years, thousands probably. It's a precog culture. And so what you just said was very important. People have to realize that, you know, although Jung spoke about the collective unconscious, I mean, how collective did it get? And it was only later in his life that he turned to the I Ching to get a deeper understanding of the larger picture, let's say. So I found the psychological information in the book very interesting, very apropos, because a lot of people have still got a fixed idea about synchronicity that comes from Jung. And you have the ability to say, well, let's look at it another way, because there are multiple different ways of looking at how this all works out, which brings us actually to the next part of our discussion as we move along here, because I'm interested in your you're pointing out that it happens to us all the time, this precognition, retrocausation. It happens to us all the time. The unconscious has got a very large part to play in it, especially if it's our conscious life displaced in time, which I think is a beautiful idea. It's already set up that way for our survival, for our evolution. And so how come we don't get it? How come it's not so much more obvious? And you made the very important point is that we don't record these subtle signals coming from the future. We don't remember our dreams, but it's our writers and our artists who get it. So could you share a bit of that with us, Eric? Because I thought it was very important.
Yeah, well, there's two things to say about this. You know, is it important for us to be conscious of precognition? That's an open question, and that I think alludes to what you want to get to at the end of the interview, maybe about where does this go in the future. But you know, my basic argument is this is an unconscious process. In fact, it is the unconscious. You know, it's, you know, what, you know, Freud essentially created a theory of precognition without knowing what he was creating. You know, he interpreted it very differently, but he essentially gave us a theory of precognition that we can run with, because, you know, there's a lot there. But yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily need to remember our dreams to be affected by them. I mean, I think it's very well, I think, understood or accepted in psychology that dreams serve a mnemonic process. They're part of our metabolizing of our experience, okay? And what I'm adding to this is that, well, they're metabolizing our future experience as well as our past, so it's not just memories from recent experiences. They're also drawing in future experiences. But the ultimate effect is, obviously dreams are hard to remember, so we're probably not necessarily supposed to remember our dreams. I think it's not necessarily a necessary survival function to be able to remember what I dreamed last night. It's like that's somehow what I dreamed last night is still, it's part of my it's part of my brain. It's affecting my responses and my choices and what I do. But then, yes, then you have artists, and not just artists. You have shamans, and you have people who are much more attuned to their inner life. Okay. And these people, I think, serve a necessary cultural function, right? I mean, these are people who are able to, they are able to get in touch with our collective unconscious, if you want to put it that way. I mean, my concept of the collective unconscious is much more materialist than I think Jung's is, but the common body of experience and knowledge in the world and history, it's like there's some people who are able to sort of, take that and internalize it and then produce artworks and so forth that really help guide the rest of us. Now, yeah, like you said, artists are where you're going to find the most consistent and compelling evidence for this. I mean, if you're trying to prove to a skeptic that this stuff is real, go to certain artists. I would cite, Philip K. Dick. Everyone knows the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. This guy was, incredibly precognitive. I mean, he was, in the sense that he was aware of his precognition. He was recording his dreams. He was writing stories that were coming true. He was, there's so many examples in his life. It's just not even, books have been written on this. I mean, he's a phenomenon, but it's not just him. There's a lot of writers. The more I delve into the lives of writers, the more you find this stuff. I mean, it's just incredible. My favorite example from the book actually isn't a science fiction writer. You sort of associate this with sci-fi, but Norman Mailer, this post-war American novelist, very the opposite of a fantasy or sci-fi novelist, is writing these very sort of realistic stories about the war and stuff like that. Well, his second novel was this kind of weird, he had trouble writing. He had this sort of, he was sort of channeling this kind of story that just came to him, and he didn't think it was realistic, but he just had to sort of honor it, as he was receiving it, and he sort of, hammered out this novel. And it was about this sort of novelist like himself who had rented a room in this Brooklyn Heights rooming house with a bunch of other like crazy characters, and they were all artists in one way or another. And one of them turned out to be a KGB spy, and he's sort of hounded by this other guy who's an FBI agent, so forth. Well, he thought it was really unrealistic to have this rooming house full of these characters, but whatever. Okay, whatever. He did it. He wrote this novel, and the novel was panned. Critics hated it. Whatever. He moved on. He moved out of New York, moved to Hollywood, moved back to New York, and this is like 6 years later, and he's stunned when he sees the New York Times headline that this top KGB spy is caught, and it's the guy with the room right one floor down from him in his Brooklyn Heights building. Okay, and he's a guitar, and he knew him as a guitarist. Okay, this guy's an artist, and he's thinking this guy's this old guitarist. Turns out he's like this top KGB colonel who's been running a spy ring out of this. And he was nailed by the FBI, it's just like and so Norman Mailer's just, what the hell, I wrote a story about this and here it's happening and it's the guy who lives right below me. It's like, this is, so that kind of experience, I mean, that's the kind of experience Phil Dick would have. And Phil Dick, by the end of his life, was just so used to it. I was like, yeah, this is happening again. But this is happening to a writer we wouldn't even associate with that kind of thing. And the thing is, it's true again and again and again and again with artists. It's just, it's so incredible. This is what I'm working on now, actually, is sort of a follow-up book to Time Loops. It's about this kind of experience in the lives of artists and creative people.
Fascinating. Novelty.
Yeah.
Spies, sexy incidents, plane crashes, catastrophic stuff. We know in remote viewing that it's a lot easier to remote view a destructive target. The World Trade Center is extremely easy to remote view. In fact, where I studied, the Farsight Institute has just come out with a new video about all of the work they did on remote viewing that particular target. And I was interested in reading a Time Loops that Joe McMoneagle had actually confessed. I think he's going to be a heretic in the remote viewing community, because he said, sooner or later, the target, comes out of the envelope and we know what it is. And I've done this thousands of times. And the target is, and you're going to be there at that point, maybe even the one announcing it. So in the future what the target is. And he said, well, I think all I'm doing is seeing the target being disclosed in the future, rather than some very difficult operation of the psyche, so that, remote viewing becomes somehow connected to this whole story. And we won't go into too much detail about it, but one episode that struck me when I was learning, I found out that two Stargate remote viewers remote viewed the same Kremlin office, because we're talking about spies. They both remote viewed it 10 years apart. That was their target, this office. One of the remote viewers was so good, I think it was Pat Price, he could actually open the drawer and he could actually read files, which was astonishing, right? And while he's doing this, this other guy shows up who's remote viewing the same target 10 years before or later. Does it matter? And they're both aware of the presence of each other at the target. So that would certainly suggest that this quantum entanglement is working in both directions simultaneously, causality from the future and the past. It doesn't really make any difference. It gets all very difficult for the average mind to wrap itself around. But you're opening this door. The artists are the ones who are showing it. Phil K. Dick, I mean, Electric Dreams is now hugely popular on Netflix. And so that will lead people more to Phil Dick and maybe read the exegesis and maybe start figuring out, wow, it was all precog, what this guy was doing. That's the simplest explanation. It was all precog. So I look forward to your next book. When do you anticipate it coming out?
Oh, it's still in the writing stages right now. I don't know. I'm hoping a couple years maybe. I don't know.
Well, I think that's an appropriate moment. We haven't learned anything about your past. To write a book like this, and Nick Herbert says at the back, he's the author of Quantum Reality. A lot of our nerds will know Nick Herbert. Time Loops is the definitive inquiry into cases of people who remember their future. Eric Wargo is the Sherlock Holmes of retro causation. Now that's a really cool new title. You're the Sherlock Holmes of retro causation.
I like that one.
But it's an incredibly well-researched, solid, robust tome that, the skeptics are going to have a hard time with it, which is really good news. But in order to write this, you obviously have had to read a lot. And you mentioned in a communication with me that you had been to Prague in the 90s, which is the alchemical center of the world, and that one of the alchemists' adages was meditate, yes, meditate, but read, 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 read. So could you go into your reading life and how you managed to collate all this material?
Well, it's the, this book is the product of 10 years of research on this. So, you can read a lot in 10 years, and I read a lot anyway, but so, this was not created overnight. As far as Prague goes, yeah, that was a kind of, I would say, a turning point for me intellectually, because I had not really been aware of alchemy until that point. And I'm referring to Western European, the European alchemical tradition. Yes, I was living there. A lot of Americans went to Prague in the mid 90s. It was sort of a kind of mecca. It was, after the communist governments had fallen at the end of the 80s, and they were sort of reconstituting their economies, and it was an exciting and, for a Westerner, inexpensive place to live and have fun and so forth. But it's a fascinating city with just an amazing intellectual tradition, and that goes back to the 16th and 17th century, and the Emperor Rudolph II, who was this kind of little crazy patron of alchemists and scientists and astronomers and so forth, astrologers from all over Europe. And so, John Dee and Edward Kelly went over there from England and spent some time, and just wonderful stuff. And this was the same time as Rabbi Lev, who, legendarily created the golem. It was just a wonderful, magical ferment of intellectual ideas and magical ideas. Anyway, so right when I was there, I think in 97 or 96, there was a big alchemical conference held there, and it was a big exhibition of Rudolph II. And it was like, I didn't know anything about this stuff, but I was attending these these meetings of alchemy scholars. I thought, wow, this is really fascinating, and hanging out with people who'd sort of gravitated to alchemy out of other sort of mystical traditions, and what was exciting was, wow, here's our own European mystical tradition. Like, so many people look to the East, and I'd always look to the East. I'd always, Buddhism had always been sort of my touchstone, but here was a European thing that was very different in flavor and much more, in a way, much more accessible, I think, to a Westerner. And so that really turned me on to alchemy. And of course, via alchemy, one discovers Jung, and via Jung, I discovered Gnosticism and, ancient Gnostic texts and so forth. And so that sort of really began my, kind of adult spiritual journey, I guess. And
without which you wouldn't have arrived at this book, quite possibly.
Right.
It was
Exactly.
It was a defining retrocausal event in a sense. That one of the last things that Terence McKenna did was he went to the very same city around about that time to make a video about alchemy. It was the last thing that he produced, and he's actually walking through castles and talking about the aforementioned kind of little bit different leader who sponsored the alchemists. So yes, alchemy was the foundation of our science, which has now conveniently forgotten the 80% submerged portion, which is all about things that we now think are, remote viewing is not new. Retrocausation is not new. None of these are actually new concepts, but we're finally getting around to grappling with them at the kind of leading edge. And it will take probably, 50 years, who knows, for it to trickle down to the mainstream where they're still teaching you, Newtonian universe. But you have arrived, you and other people, interestingly, around the same age group, interestingly, around the world. It's like, for me, as an older researcher, it's like seeing finally a solid next wave is coming. It's not flaky new age stuff. It's not so difficult quantum stuff that, only 3 guys on the planet can get it. It's comprehensive because it takes in remote viewing. It takes in synchronicity, the unconscious. It takes in Jung and alchemy. It takes in so many things. And finally, what it has to take in, which is the fundamental biggest mystery of our age, which is, of course, what is the UFO? And
Yep.
I know that Jacques Vallée was a great inspiration for you, as he was for me and many others. And you've recently met Whitley Strieber, who's also gone way beyond the original ideas that these are aliens somehow, coming to abduct us for our sperm or some ridiculous idea. You had a UFO experience in 2006, was it?
2009. Yeah.
2009. Did that really shake you up?
No, it didn't. These were, they were distant. This was not an up close and personal, close encounter of the third kind of thing. They were just lights in the sky. Really, it was weird. And it was enough to get me to read Jacques Vallée, basically. It was enough to get me to get into the UFO literature and realize, oh my God, there's serious people, smart people writing about this. And this is a really interesting subject. And the thing with, I certainly had never had problems with the idea of UFOs or extraterrestrials or whatever. And of course, as a newbie, I just assumed, these are extraterrestrials. I didn't know any better at that point. But, inevitably you wind up reading Jacques Vallée, and he's, like you said, he's saying much more interesting things about the UFO that, this is not, there's no evidence that this is an extraterrestrial phenomenon. This is something, on the one hand, much closer to home, but also far more weird and absurd, and, he even likened them, to the Zen koan. He's the first one that I know of who made that analogy with UFOs. And also he himself is very strongly influenced by the alchemical Hermetic tradition. I mean, he's a Paracelsus guy. Paracelsus is his big influence. He's he thinks the universe is sort of structured in this kind of way that reflects that's much closer to something Paracelsus would have argued. So he's coming out of a very Hermetic alchemical tradition too. I only learned that subsequent, but when I first encountered his writings, now he's not only talking about UFOs as something much weirder than extraterrestrials, he's also linking it to psychic phenomena and ESP. And that's what led me to the road of this book, which was, researching parapsychology, researching precognition, because, it's interesting if you read his journals, even back in the 70s, he was hanging out with the remote viewers at the Stanford Research Institute, and he was giving them ideas. He was a computer scientist, and he was sort of coming at it from a different angle than they were as physicists. And he was suggesting looking at it as as an addressing problem, finding information in a database. And so that's what gave Ingo Swann the idea of using coordinates initially. But also, he was also sitting, he'd have lunches where he would say to these guys, well, how do you know this is clairvoyance? How do you know that you're seeing things across space and not seeing the future? How do you know that you're not seeing that revelation of what was in the envelope later? So he was thinking these thoughts back in the 1970s. And so like that, that's the kind of thing that really inspired me, I think, in this book.
Well, this seems to be happening. He was like the only guy really at that time who was bringing disparate totally unconnected fields together. Parapsychology, extraterrestrials, remote viewing. Now we're seeing many more people are beginning to sense that we're talking about one thing here. We're talking about one thing. And if you were to represent that one thing by anything, it would be the UFO, because the UFO defies all explanations, totally defies. Anytime you think you got it, you don't have it, which brings us to Zen. I didn't know that Jacques Vallée had, I thought I was the guy who came up with the term flying koans, but it looks like Jacques Vallée beat me to it.
You do it in 1975.
Wow, way ahead of his time, because ongoing exposure to UFO, like Whitley Strieber, well, in his case, it's much closer. Ongoing exposure causes existential crisis. Nothing can explain this. And if I hadn't seen what I saw, I would never have started to practice shamanism, study science, go into psychology, go look at psychoanalysis and anthropology. I would never have gone near any of those. At the time I was a businessman. I was interested in, self-help books. So that one phenomenon just busted open this whole giant koan of try and figure me out, baby. See how well your brain sustains it. So this does bring us to Zen, because the tradition of Zen has always been about direct experience of the now, without any filters, any skyhooks, any religion, any belief, nothing. You got nothing except the question if you're doing koans. And you're not going to get the answer easily. So tell us how you got into Zen.
Well, it was a gradual process. My parents were very secular. My father had given up the Catholic Church when he moved away from home and never looked back. I think there's a lot of people like that. And so my parents, I was brought up without any kind of religious background. I think my religion when I was a kid was sci-fi, science fiction. Star Trek was and probably is my religion in a way. But in college, I devoured, spiritual literature. I read everything by Alan Watts, when I was in college. I remember like a span of, probably 2 weeks, I read everything by Alan Watts, and that sort of, and so that kind of plants the seed, and I was, in fact, I even read Shunryu Suzuki, in college, but I wasn't patient enough to really meditate at that point. I was just thinking about the ideas, but I think the Prague experience, took me back to, I'd been with the sciences for several years by that point and was steeped in science and stuff. And I think I needed that. And Prague is what kind of, boom, that was like, that directed me back toward mysticism and spirituality. And then it's funny, I think it's those, I started meditating in earnest about 2001, and really it was, at that point in my life, my mind was just going crazy in all different directions. I knew I need to get control of my mind here, the monkey mind. And so meditation just came naturally, and I sort of returned to the Zen stuff that I'd always loved, and was able to deepen my reading with a little more, original sources, not just, secondary sources. And so ever since probably 2000, I've dipped in and out of Zen for various periods of time, and read very deeply while I'm meditating very intensely, and then I'll sort of get away from it for a while, and and gradually I'll find I need it again and I'll come back to it. So it's not like I haven't had a continuous practice since then, but I'd say I've had a continuous practice for about the last 10 years, which has been, very, very important.
And how do you, Eric, how do you see the function of the koan? What does it function for? What's its purpose?
Well, it's to break you open, it's to it's a seductive, it's like you can think of it in all kinds of ways. You can think of it as a lure, that's just, it won't let you go, and you chase after it, and then at some point, boom, it explodes you. But, I've never had any luck working with, the koans from the classic text. I mean, I love reading, like the Blue Cliff Record. I love dipping into these texts and just reading these koans. But the ones that grip me are the ones that I don't realize that they're gripping me. And they're things like, what is a UFO? Or thinking, four-dimensionally about what happens at the surface of a black hole. These kinds of scientific questions. I think we have lots of koans available to us.
I think that's a very valid and important statement. We don't need to be going back to, what is your original face before you were born, because that's their age. I think somebody came up with the expression, Buddha didn't know how to use a computer. We got to remember that this is the future, and that we are vastly more information wise, and we have so many different ways that we can use what's around us as koans. And in my experience, these impossible flying lights, which are absolutely definitely after a few months, this is not a vehicle. The timing of this thing showing up is always when I show up. So, are these guys looking at their watch, and they're using a lot of gas to track this little guy on the ground here, I mean, it becomes so absurd that, absurdity is a really important part of the Zen tradition too. It's too bloody absurd. And now we have absurdity everywhere. I mean, you're in Washington, the absurdity center of the galaxy, right? I mean, what's going on there is so absurd. It's a koan,
How because you could use Trump as a koan.
That's right.
I haven't thought about that, but I'd rather not. I'd rather not. Yeah,
no,
I have to think about it.
We need something a bit smarter than that. But we have all this. More and more people are asking better and better questions, which leads us to the gigantic, really wonderful koans about what's going on here actually right now. Is it the brain? Is it consciousness? The important questions we return to that people like Paracelsus and all his cronies, they were handling long time ago. We forgot the good questions, and you're bringing up good questions. So where could this unfold to as more and more people read time loops and figure out what it actually means, the loop, right? Once they get that, this could set off a reverberation that might lead to, for example, what could happen over the next few years?
That's a great question. And I've thought about it a lot, and I still don't have any one answer. There's the obvious answer that, and it's the same thing you'd get, I'm sure, with, thinking about remote viewing. What could this do for us? I mean, there's the obvious, that we can be more conscious agents in our lives, by looking ahead of us and so forth. That's not so much my interest. And the reason is, I think we're already doing that. I think, as I said, like with the dreams and stuff, the purpose of dreams is not, I think, for us to have a precognitive flash of something ahead of us, because we're never going to understand it. We're never going to understand quite what it means until that event comes to pass. But what we can get is this, we can reinforce, when we discover these precognitive dreams, we can reinforce this sense of ourselves as four-dimensional creatures. That's what I really see the teaching, I guess, of this idea of precognition, retrocausation, in a block universe that's teaching that we are four-dimensional creatures, and that we may all through our lives be thinking with our whole lives. I mean, we may, that our whole life from birth to death might be present right here, right now, and that we're bringing it to bear on the present situation, and that's what the unconscious means. Getting to grips with that idea and reinforcing it through precognitive experiences where we discover, oh my God, I dreamed about this event last night, or a year ago, or 20 years ago. It's really mind-blowing, the more time you spend with this, to have those experiences that of precognition that span a really large block of your life. I mean, it's one thing to, wow, I dreamed this moment last night, and that's pretty cool. But, oh my God, I dreamed this moment 20 years ago, and I can open up my dream journal and go, holy, holy crap, I dreamed this 20 years ago. I mean, that is a sublime and mind-blowing experience to have. And the more we have these experiences, and this is what this is what I want other people to have. This is why I tell people, keep a dream journal, record these things. Because when you start having this experience, it is transformative of your life. And where it leads to is, I don't think of this as a superpower. I don't think of, we're going to be these superpowered precogs peering into the future and stuff like that. I think what it is it gives you this intense feeling of your life as this four-dimensional big thing. And it really gives you the sense of you as a really massive creature, much bigger than you realize. It's easy for us to forget how big our lives are and important our lives are. But these experiences really focus you on your biography. I've started to think of biography as like the really operative term in understanding human life, not psychology. I have no use for the term psychology anymore, because I think it totally falsifies, this notion of scientifically studying human behavior totally falsifies who we are as creatures. But biography is a much better term, the story of our life, because it's that whole story that exists already, and through studying our dreams and synchronicities, we can start to get a sense of that larger four-dimensional unity. And I think just getting that sense, it's not only empowering, but it just really profoundly gives you a feeling of how valuable your life is, and how valuable by extension, another life is. I think anything that enhances the value of life is really important right now, because I mean that's what materialism, has done, is just cheapened our lives and cheapened the life of the planet. So again, just getting a sense of the value of our own lives as this continuous four-dimensional story, I think will help us get a sense of the life of the planet.
The four-dimensional Hulk. I love it.
Right.
It's important to understand that the multiple worlds theory, I am free to choose any possible future out of the infinite number of possible worlds. This ridiculous idea that I can be totally, in a sense it's ridiculous. I can be master of my fate because I can choose any one of these possible futures. Whereas what you're suggesting very strong in this book is, hey, this only works because it happens. It happens in this future. And isn't it interesting that it was the Western mind that created all of these scientific ideas of the multiple choice, I'm free to do what the hell I want galaxy, and that's exactly what the West has done. Raped and pillaged the planet, lied and stolen and overtaken and screwed everything up because, hey, I can do what I want. I'm free, baby. But none of this came out of the East, which has always had the feeling of acquiescence to the natural unfolding of your life, which is already, they never said it was set. That wasn't a question even. It's like, yeah, we just acquiesce to the flow, and it tends to be more peaceful. Yeah, it's the Tao. It tends to be more peaceful that way. So in a paradoxical sense, here's a very intellectual Westerner is bringing people a subversive idea, which at first they won't realize how subversive it is. But if you go right down this rabbit hole, what you're going to find is what you've just suggested. And that, I think, is phenomenal. And I really hope that it works out that way. Now, in conclusion, I would like to strongly recommend that people read your blog, which is called The Nightshirt, subtitled Sightings, Portents, Forebodings, Suspicions. I've read 4 of your articles over the last few days, including Passion of Einstein, subtitled Light, Space-Time, and the Holy Grail, which was, again, a brilliant synthesis of completely disparate entities here. You know, the Holy Grail, the legend of the Holy Grail, the redemptive power of Christ's blood, and light and tachyons. Wait a minute, that's really worth a read. Master Minkowski's Wild Ducks, which was a great Zen story. And your original Face on Mars, which is tantalizing because you brought up the important point that the Face on Mars had actually appeared artistically decades before Viking took those seminal photographs. And again, this brings us back to the idea that it's the really big things, the transformative events, the horrific events, the spies, the killings, the extraterrestrial face on Mars looking out at us as if we've already destroyed ourselves. That kind of power and precognition, how it links, I thought that was a very unique article indeed. So I would recommend that everybody goes to, where do they go for the Nightshirt, Eric? What's your address for that?
It's just all one word, thenightshirt.com.
I think actually that the Nightshirt it runs in parallel with time loops. If you're going to read time loops, you got to get into the Nightshirt because it will help to understand. I mean, these are not easy concepts you're giving us here. These are not facile ideas you can read while you're watching TV. You got to focus. And I think that will be for a lot of people, because you'd mentioned they're not reading anymore. You know, modern culture is not reading. Americans are not reading. Europeans are not reading. Nobody's reading anymore.
Right. It's a real
and
problem.
I hope that you help to retrocausally change that.
I hope you have changed that. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Eric. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. I think we should do some more of this, but it's going to take me ages to subtitle something like this in Japanese. It's going to really mess with my brain, but I got good help, and I'll make sure it happens. And meanwhile, the audio file will go up on iTunes. Thank you again for your time, sir. It was great.
Thank you, Ehan. This was great.
Bye for now, Eric.
Bye-bye.
Welcome to Real Rover. I'm your roving host, John Craig. Real Rover へようこそ、クレイグ・ジョンでございます。Introducing you to people you would never have heard of if it wasn't for Real Rover. Here we go.